the Eastern European expansion of NATO was very expensive and very counterproductive. Now, today on January 10th, we see the start of important negotiations between Russia and NATO. The topic is the future of Ukraine and more former Soviet states. Now, the Russians, they want to turn back NATO to the status of right around 1997. So they want to push back the Eastern European expansion. Now, the pro-Russian crowd usually says that this Eastern expansion of NATO was a very aggressive expansion, and this was a very serious move. But what was the substance of this Eastern European expansion? Now, Russia removed its tanks and its bureaucrats, but it left its espionage networks in Poland, Ukraine, the Baltics, and so on and so forth. Soviet communism kept these countries poor and very primitive. And after 1991, Moscow did not have the money to modernize those countries. So this is when the European Union went in and expanded. So Poland is the recipient of very large sums of money from the European Union. So between 2007 and 2013, over 67 billion euros actually went to Poland. That money was used for roads and airports and these sort of things. And between 2014 and 2020, Poland received over $100 billion from the EU. Now in 2022, when these countries have been modernized, Russia wants them back. If the current negotiations between Russia and NATO do not please Russia, they do consider military action. And that does not only mean invading Ukraine, that could mean invading Poland, that could mean invading the Baltics, even though those countries are NATO member states. Now, if you're a NATO member state, it does not mean you are fully protected. It does not mean that the entirety of NATO will come to your aid. It does not mean that NATO will actually go to war with Russia. Being a NATO member means that the other NATO members will protest an invasion. There are no significant NATO troops in Eastern Europe. So Russia has always the option to recapture these territories. Really fortifying these territories and really protecting them is just too expensive for NATO and especially the United States. Now, for every measure, the United States would have to cover about half of the costs. And there are some estimates that are unclassified. For example, we have the think tank CSIS. They quoted estimates up to 520 billion United States dollars for peacekeeping, so-called peacekeeping in Eastern Europe. Turning Poland or the Baltics into NATO member states was much, much cheaper. Way cheaper than actually defending them. Now, the worst calculation is for Ukraine because the country is very, very large. There are no significant natural barriers. It's hard to defend. One analyst said NATO would have to defend a border that is about as long as the distance between New York City and Miami. So a so-called peacekeeping mission of the United States in Ukraine would cost roughly $300 billion. And that is just the basic program that does not guarantee a defense, that does not guarantee victory, it does not guarantee anything. It simply made little sense to turn Eastern European states into NATO members. These former Eastern Bloc countries are full of Russian spies. Then NATO never intended to create large troops in Eastern Europe. Russia can invade Eastern Europe a lot faster than the United States could bring in its troops. In exchange for accepting the NATO Eastern European expansion, Russia was able to sell a lot of oil and gas to the European Union. And those revenues created profits, which also benefited the Russian military. A lot of important cold warriors from the United States government were against the Eastern European expansion of NATO for these kind of reasons. A predecessor of NATO was led by a man called W. Averill Harriman from the infamous family. Now, the men of the family, they tend to visit the Yale University and become members of the secret society Skull and Bones. Now, Yale and Bones are more or less organizations of the old Anglo Empire. Through Bones, we saw the creation of the more modern type intelligence agencies, such as the OSS and the CIA. Those kind of intelligence agencies that actually have a name, an address, and some sort of a public budget and some sort of accountability. But in the background, we see the control of the older type intelligence networks that go back to the aristocracy of the British colonial empire. So the Harriman family actually rebuilt the industry or powered the industry of the Soviet Union. In 1925, we saw a contract between the W.A. Harriman Company of New York and the Union of Socialist States. Also, Western oil companies were involved in the Soviet Union to make sure the Soviets could actually rebuild an empire. This reminds us of the current situation in Kazakhstan, where it is Western oil companies such as Exxon and Chevron who invest a lot of money and keep the industry going. We may be dealing with a hidden cartel of the superpowers. When there is a visible cooperation, it can be explained as trying to maintain the peace, trying to affect change through trade. At the same time, the superpowers can stage a lot of scary tension, such as we're seeing now with the negotiations between Russia and the United States about Ukraine. From the standpoint of Russian generals and Russian politicians who may not even know about the secret cartel, it is a simple calculation. Is war now more lucrative for the empire than peace? The United States can expand their power through business. The United States is much more wealthy and they can expand their power without firing any shots. The Russian economy, on the other hand, is comparatively small. Over the next 10 years, Russia may fall behind so bad that they can never actually recover and retain some sort of dominant position. They may need a war now. But not just any war, not just an invasion of Ukraine. Because if you only take Ukraine, the following sanctions might actually destroy the calculation. It's either go big or go home. From the standpoint of the Russian generals, it makes a lot of sense to retake all of the former Soviet states. That includes Poland, the Baltics, maybe even Eastern Germany. Once that is accomplished, the Russians can actually go back to the negotiating table and offer certain terms. We will treat dissidents better if you buy oil from us again. We could limit our number of nuclear weapons if you continue to trade with us. We might provide a counterbalance to communist China. A lot of unhappy conservatives in Western Europe could seize the opportunity to migrate to the east and get under the control of Moscow. It's a giant trap, and of course, NATO then would be happy to have gotten rid of these unhappy dissidents. I will keep you updated over the course of these negotiations, and I will provide a lot more background to this possible cartel of the superpowers.